All right. All right. So let's do this. Before we get in and we start talking, about chapter 20, well, one, I want to pray for us. But two, I want to bring back up some of the material that we talked about in chapter 18. And if you remember, we did 19 before we did chapter 18, because I think that makes more sense to do it that way. Chapter 19 is about the mechanisms of macroevolution. Chapter 18 is really about speciation and how do new species form, which is really just an extreme form of microevolution. So I think it makes more sense to do it that way. But I want to just, start off with a little lecture break, even though we haven't really had much lecture, and just kind of rehash some of those concepts. But before we do that, let me pray for us. Father, I want to thank you again for just the incredible privilege we have to understand what it is you reveal to us. Father, thank you so much for all that truth and that knowledge that you have revealed and you continue to reveal. Father, thank you for giving us minds that can understand that, but also minds that can't understand it fully, that there's still a mystery. There's still just this understanding that you are bigger and greater than what we even know, and the encouragement that comes from that. Father, as we're reminded of those, I pray that we would push hard to understand as much as we can, increasing on our knowledge of you and increasing in our knowledge of how we can serve you and serve others. And Father, I ask these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, so real quick, we're going to do a lecture break. I'll give you a little bit of time to get yourself oriented into groups of 6/7/8, and hopefully your discussion leader can get everybody engaged. And I want you to come up with a list of reasons. See if you can come up with 5 reasons, a list of reasons in which a population of organisms would have some kind of maladaptive form. Okay? So when you're looking at a population of organisms and you see something that you're just like, man, this is really not helpful for the survival of this organism, I want you to come up with a list of 5 explanations as far as why that form may be present, even if it is not adaptive. Okay? So go ahead and take a couple of minutes, get yourself into a group of 6/7/8, elect yourselves a leader. Leader, choose yourself a representative, although not against their will, and give me some ideas. All right, couple minutes starting now.
Oh, look, got our group, guys.
I know you had to work real hard for that one.
It's always a challenge. 5 reasons why we can have a maladaptive form.
I'm just being different, okay?
Who wants to be the leader?
Sounds like you are.
Great. Awesome. Well, first off, I'm just going to ask, who wants to present?
I had to talk about it first.
Oh, I know, but I'm going to have her present.
Oh, okay, so you think it's better?
Yeah, I'm just going to establish who's going to present first.
I can do it.
You want to do it now? All right. All right. So, first, I guess we start off with what is a maladaptive form?
Something that's not beneficial.
Beneficial.
Beneficial. I thought you said it's not official.
Yeah.
It's not an official form.
I'm not going to say anything, but I think that's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, so one that's not beneficial, then one that just causes harm to the species, or cause harm to the individuals, that could cause harm to the species later on. So how would we get one of those forms? True.
I think of a couple ways. Number one, it could be that a certain factor or something within that organism
1 minute.
evolved to
60
respond to something
seconds.
that was no longer a factor. So let's say you had an animal that evolved to swim. Okay, let's say you're a crocodile and you evolved to swim in water and everything. What if the area you live in also dried out? That's a change in the environment. Therefore, you're now the ability for you to be a swimmer is maladaptive. The other one is
Okay, so
sexual
change in
selection.
environment.
Change in environment and the sexual selection can go against that.
Yeah.
There's 2.
What we're talking about, we're talking about bad genes can be hidden with the good
Oh yeah, during the crossing over
Yep. So there's
events during meiosis.
kind of slip in there.
Yep.
Kimmy
Environment,
and
some environments with
Russ.
or can be
Oh yeah.
like how we talked about the
Couldn't remember his name for a second.
You guys got any beneficial info?
Or are you part of the maladaptive portions group?
Oh, that
10 seconds.
that was harsh. Or are you part, or are you in maladaptive form in this group?
That was a joke.
All right. All right. Luckily, it wasn't your group leader that offended you, thus. Did you even notice what he said to you? That's okay. You heard it, Kimmy? Are you offended for Russ? No, you're not. Okay. All right, so what are some ideas? Why should it not necessarily surprise us when we find a maladaptive form in a particular population? What are some reasons, some explanations for its existence? Is this all one group?
yeah.
Wow, that's right at 8. Nicely done. All right, what do we have? Who's our spokesperson? I mean, who's your spokesperson? Just
How like with peacocks, how though they have the bigger tail feathers.
Yeah.
It's more so for sexual selection.
yes. Yeah, it's not it doesn't really actually help it to survive any better in its environment. In fact, it actually hinders it. So much so that they don't have those massive tails all year round, but only just prior to when it's egg laying season. Yeah. Good, I love it. So sexual selection, oftentimes working in opposition to natural selection. Group in the back.
We came up with maybe drastic environmental changes could have happened in which the whatever functions that we had before that worked in that past environment
Yeah.
didn't have enough time to change the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great idea. Just a rapid environmental shift. So it may have been well adapted for an environment that no longer exists. You see this a lot in plants. Plants tend to have really long lifespans. So you can have trees sticking around in an area where they shouldn't exist anymore, but they've been there for 500 years. So it's like, what are you going to do? You just kind of let them be, right? They're kind of the grumpy old people. You just kind of let them be and realize that all of their offspring are moving. They're just shifting with environmental shifts. Yeah, so you see it a lot in plants. Good. You also see it in some animals that only live now at really high elevations. Because at one point, you see this a lot in North America, where at one point in the recent history, most of North America was Arctic. It was really cold. A lot of it was covered in glacial deposits. And so a lot of North America was Arctic, permanently frozen substrate, a lot of mosses doing well. And you find this in high elevation, still organisms that really aren't really well suited for high elevation living, but they just kind of exist because that's the only place that still has somewhat of those Arctic-like characteristics. Good. What do we have here?
Talked about a lot of those other things. Something else that Chad mentioned was that the idea of the poor phenotypes piggybacking on
Yeah.
other
Absolutely, yeah. So oftentimes you can't separate the allele of one gene from the allele of a completely separate gene. The genes are just too close together on the chromosome. So something may be really, really helpful, and so it's being selected for, but it comes along with something that's maladaptive. Yeah. Yeah. Good. And then what do we have up here?
Those are the three we had.
Okay. And you can go with any evolutionary force that is not natural selection, right? So sexual selection is going to be a good explanation for maladaptive forms. Genetic drift, great explanation for maladaptive forms, right? It's random. And so you could have some weird phenotype that just happens to be the people that survive, or the individuals that survive have that weird phenotype because the individuals that were more fit were all killed by some kind of a freak accident. Gene flow is another one, where you can have individuals showing up on this island from the mainland, and they're really in no way adapted for the island. They just keep showing up, right? Because the island is just, it's inviting, right? They want to be there, but they're not really well suited for island living. And then you could also do, what am I missing? Oh, mutations, right? Our other evolutionary force. You have some kind of a genetic mutation that coupled with something else just doesn't, natural selection hasn't had time to get rid of it yet, right? All of those are great explanations for why you might expect to find some maladaptive forms. Or another way of thinking about that, explanations for why you shouldn't be surprised if you find something that just doesn't make sense. We see this a lot with behaviors, where it's like, wow, this behavior doesn't seem to suit this species well. And oftentimes it's best explained by it's just kind of either a behavior that's piggybacked from something that was really important, or that it used to help it in a previous existence. It's selected for in a previous life, if you will. Yeah.
Are behaviors more genetic or environmentally driven?
Depends on what the organisms you're talking about.
Okay.
The only organism where it's even up for debate is humans. In every other organism, it's very clearly, even if the organism has some ability to overcome its programming, it's still overwhelmingly programmed behavior.
Okay.
Humans are the only ones that are open for debate, and it seems to be that we are unique in our ability to overcome our programming. But you still can't really get away from the fact that there are certain genetic predispositions to certain behaviors. And so, how much, who knows?
Okay.
But yeah, in humans, it's really the only place where it's up for debate. And you get this whole, is it nature, is it nurture? And the answer is it's both, right? It's a combination of both. And then you have to realize that nature and nurture are not discrete ideas, right? Your nature, your environment impacts your nurture, your environment impacts your genetic composition as well. Like, it influences how things develop. So it's complex. Yeah.
Asking a question when it comes to like the desirable trait versus undesirable trait. Could that be like an example of that? Be like the presence of like hip displacement in like German shepherds, just because like they over constant breeding because of this trait has then caused.
Yeah, so that's a developmental abnormality that's kind of comes along with a certain desired phenotype, right? So there are certain developmental abnormalities that come along with something else. And so, yeah, that'd be best explained by a piggybacking, but it's not natural selection that's the force, it's artificial selection. But there are a lot of similarities, right?
Yeah.
We selected things we wanted, right? We wanted a dog that's aggressive but controlled, that's powerful, that's compact, that's fast, right? And there are certain things that come along with that, certain developmental abnormalities that are possible. Yeah.
I mean, could we, like, it's kind of obvious, but like maladaptions, can we also like explain that just from a really biblical side, like the fall, like the reason why
Sure,
animals
yeah.
go downhill, or like even like after the fall, like I mean, I guess it's more of an adaptation, but like there's going to be thorns and you're going to have weeds in the garden, like
Right, that creation just can't keep up, right? Can't keep up with the downward spiral. Yeah, sure. Now, there does seem to be where there's like curse pronounced on specific parts of creation, right? And you even see that as you read Romans 8, and it talks about, creation groaning under the curse, right? Under this weight. And even when you read like the accounts in Genesis after the flood, and God, promises that he's not going to curse the land again. And it seems to be more than just a promise that he's not going to destroy it with water, but that there's some kind of a curse on it, right, specifically on it. It's very interesting, the language there, and there's a question of, well, what's actually going on, right? Were there parts of creation that were specifically, obviously, Scripture seems to indicate that the serpent was specifically cursed, right, in a very direct way, right? But even beyond that, then there's a question, or is it solely just like, the world is moving to a point in which God has to recreate, right? Is that where you actually a new creation, not a recreation? Is it just that these organisms can't keep up? Or in addition to that, were they cursed in specific ways? Is it both? Right? Either way, it's a great explanation for why you should expect to see maladaptive characteristics. Yeah. All right. So in chapter 18, we saw speciation, very much just the extent of what microevolution can accomplish. In chapter 20, we're going to start talking about the tree of life and macroevolutionary ideas. On Friday, we're going to have plenty of time to do a discussion Friday, and we're going to focus our attention on the fossil record. And on Friday, just to prepare you for what's coming, because I like to do that, so you know what's coming. And by the way, I just want you to know we have 31 out of the 34, really only 33, because somebody asked me this morning, can they drop the class, and they're going to bring me the form. So we have 31 out of the 33 people registered for this course here, and the only two that aren't are in Alabama, representing the Masters University in soccer, right? So this is great. Thank you all for welcoming me back in such a wonderful way. But anyways, so Friday, I like to keep you, just aware of what's going on. We're gonna focus on the fossil record, because today and on Wednesday we're gonna say, all right, well, what information can we get from phylogenies? What story is being told? And then on Friday we're gonna say, okay, well, let's apply this to the fossil record and see what fits that story better, right? Is it just kind of this one tree of life phylogeny idea, or is it a different explanation altogether? All right. So in 20, basically the piece of information I want you to take before we talk about anything else is, even outside of holding to a view of origins in which there is a creator that created some of the diversity of life, even outside of that idea, even from an idea well within this idea of universal common descent, all life coming from a single survival machine, there's an enormous amount of debate as to whether macroevolution, this idea of universal common descent, is or is not just an extension of microevolution. Okay, there's a lot of debate about whether what you're looking at is or is not just extrapolating what microevolution does, but over long periods of time. And so even outside of an idea where there's a creator that's responsible for some of the diversity of life, there are ideas that there's some mechanism that's not part of those 5 forces of microevolution: mutations, natural selection, sexual selection, gene flow, and genetic drift, that there's something outside of those 5 that has to be in place to have these large-scale changes. Keep that in mind. All right, so framing questions. We're only going to have time to do the first 3 because I wanted to do the beginning, our lecture break, review what happened, because we haven't seen each other in a long, long time. And I was going to say I've been lonely, but that's not true. I've been with my family. But I have missed you. So what information can we gather from the branches in a phylogeny? We've talked a lot about phylogenies this semester, but we haven't just sat down and said, okay, well, what is this actually telling us? What do these branches mean? How can phylogenies be confusing? And then the third question, how does phylogenetics differ from taxonomy? All right, so first, what information can we gather from the branches in a phylogeny? So keep in mind, remember, if you will, that phylogenetic trees are illustrating the relationships. So every branch in this phylogenetic tree represents some group. And if you want to get it to the point where the branches can't branch any further, every one of those smallest branches possible would be a unique population. Okay? But regardless of how small your branches are, every branch represents some group. And then by how those branches are positioned gives you some information about the relationships among those groups in your phylogeny. So the closer the branches are, the more closely the groups are related, right? That makes sense. Hopefully. The closer the branches are to each other, the more closely these groups are related. And so Joey and I had a conversation several weeks ago about why he is more likely to be, more similar genetically to his siblings than he is to me, right? And so we can, if you wanted to, this would be kind of fun. Humans are just so strange that we can kind of do whatever we want if you're going to do a phylogeny of humans. And you could do a phylogeny that just represents Joey's family, right? And you can have a branch that represents my family. My branch would be better than his branch, obviously, because it's my branch, right? But anyways, you could do that, and it would make sense if you're going to do branches representing single families, that his branch and my branch would be closer together than his branch and somebody who grew up on the other side of the world that has a much different ancestry than he and I do. Okay? That would make sense, right? Same idea with if your branches are representing bigger groups. So the point at which two branches meet is called a branching point. Okay? Which kind of makes sense. You follow those branches back, you get to a point where they meet. It's called the branching point or a node. And I don't think this term is actually used in the text, but you see it often, a node. And each node represents the ancestor of the branches that come from that node. Okay? So it's saying something very specific. It's not just saying, hey, these two branches are close together, so there's some relationship there. No, the branching point, the point at which those branches coalesce or those branches converge, okay, that's a specific ancestor that then gave rise to both those branches. Make sense? Okay, so the two branches that share a node are called sister taxa. Two branches that share a node are called sister taxa. This will all start to fall into place when we start bringing back some of the phylogenies we've seen so far this semester, and you'll love it. You're like, man, I didn't even know what I would do with all that wonderful information, and now I do, and I feel amazing. I feel amazing. It's going to happen. Prepare yourself. So one thing I want to point out is it doesn't really matter how long the branches are, usually, unless the phylogeny is slapped on top of the fossil record or slapped on top of like a geological timescale. In a typical phylogeny, the length of the branches doesn't represent time. Okay? And so I want you to know that. And so, just because your phylogeny looks like this, really? Porn off? Thank you. Oh, didn't even leave us a working marker. It's so selfish. Thank you. Is this yours? No. Maybe, is it yours? Man, look at this. He is going to leave us a working marker. I'm going to look like a mean person. Oh, Kornoff. Okay. So just because your phylogeny looks like this, you can't necessarily say that there's an enormous amount of time to get back to this node. Okay? It just tends to be when you only have a few branches, you make those branches separate pretty low, and then you just give yourself a lot of space for activities, right? So you can write a bunch of stuff on here and make your phylogeny look pretty. But you can't go and say, wow, this was a really long time ago, and that this ancestor wasn't all that long after this ancestor. Okay? Phylogenies don't give us any real indication of how much time has passed, unless, of course, like I said, they're superimposed on top of the geological timescale, and they're showing you when the branching actually happened. All right. So, in order to determine which groups are more primitive, so which groups are less derived, you have to root the tree. Otherwise, your phylogenetic tree, it's not a tree, it's like a ring. And you saw some of those in the text as you were going through chapter 20 in preparation for today. An unrooted tree, it's not really a tree at all, it's just a ring, and it doesn't let you know which groups are more primitive and which are more derived until you root the tree. And the only way to do that, and this is where it's very interesting, the only way to root a phylogenetic tree is to assume the ancestor that exists outside of that tree. To where you have to use an organism that's believed to be related to all the organisms in your tree, but isn't part of that tree. This is where it's interesting. So even to just build a phylogenetic tree, you have to assume universal common descent. You can't build it without that assumption. You have to assume common descent. And then the last bit of information that we can gather from a phylogenetic tree is from polytomies. And polytomies, again, we've talked about this many times, they illustrate that we don't understand the relationships. And I would argue that oftentimes they illustrate that they are not related in the way we think they are, that they do not come from common descent. It's another discussion for another time that we've had many times already. All right, any questions about this, about what information we can gather from a phylogenetic tree? So I don't want you to ever look at this and think time, unless this is superimposed on what? The geological time scale, right? And to say we drew this phylogeny over the Paleozoic era, and all of these were inside of the Cambrian, and then you would be like, oh wow, that was rapid diversification, which would make sense because we have what's called the Cambrian explosion, where you just have a whole bunch of different forms of life showing up at the same time. But then if you saw a phylogeny like this, all these lines would be dotted, and that would mean that we have no representative of those forms. Not necessarily that we don't know what that ancestor would need to look like, but that we have no representative of that. So here on the left is a branched tree representing all life forms, and here on the right is an unbranched tree. So over here on the right, if you were asked the question, which of these three domains is most primitive, you could not answer it. There's no way you can answer it from this diagram, which is most primitive. Now this one, you absolutely could. And looking at this rooted tree, which is most primitive? Bacteria. Okay? The bacteria would be the most primitive because it required the least amount of branches to get to this group. Why we have this group in blue that only required one branch. And you're like, well, what about this group in green, right? It's only one branch. But yeah, none of the living forms are inside of this portion. By the time we get to this portion, we're at 1, 2, 3 branches before we get to any living forms. Okay? So now this would believe to be the most primitive group. This is an interesting question. What do you use to root this tree? This is every living organism in this tree. What do you use to root this tree?
Bacteria.
No, you can't, because bacteria have to be here. You can't use bacteria. This is where it's interesting. Usually the way we root this tree is you design like a theoretical original cell that just has a membrane, right? It's just, you call it a micelle. It's just a pocket of fluid with a membrane, and you use that to root the tree. Because that's what your original cell would have had to look like if you're going to get living forms from non-living forms. This is kind of fun. Now you could, if this was all based on genetic material, you could root this tree by just doing some nonsense piece of DNA, right? That's not really like the DNA of living organisms, but you could do it that way. But that's kind of an interesting one. Like, what do you use to root a tree that includes all living forms? Oh, here's the illustration of sister taxa, 2 branches sharing a node. That's just wonderful. I don't know why they don't call them brother taxa, probably because that's aggressive. And so sister taxa, and there's a polytomy, an illustration that we don't understand those relationships, or an illustration that maybe they're not related in any other way other than that they both exist, right? All right. Our next one, and this is where we'll have another lecture break, because I know you had really enjoyed that first one, and you're hungry for more, especially since I told you we're going to think back to all the phylogenies we've seen so far this semester, and you're waiting for it. You know, it's really fun for me to put actions into your mind, right? To imagine that you actually feel and behave in a certain way. So it's fun for me. Don't ruin that for me by telling me, no, Dr. Engel, I actually am not very excited about doing that. Okay, just let me believe. All right. Now, because the branch lengths don't represent time, we can't read them with any amount of time. So that automatically is confusing, right? You look at this phylogeny and you're like, why did we draw it this way? Why not just have this first part of the branch be really long and then separate it that way? And I don't know. There's just multiple ways in which you can draw that tree. And so that's confusing, right? You look at it and you want to see time, but you can't. You can't. Another thing that makes phylogenies confusing, wow, is that sister groups are oftentimes really different. So you have 2 sister groups, and they branch a single time, but they're so different. And it actually is because of one of two things. Either the branch did happen a really long time ago, so there's just a single branch that separates those sister taxa, and there's been a long time of diversification, or maybe they aren't actually sister taxa, right? So they don't actually share an ancestor. Either way, it makes this story a little bit confusing. Now, another thing that is confusing is sometimes when you're looking at this phylogenetic tree, let's say this feature here that separated this branch from the rest was the presence of a nucleus. And you're like, I've got a suspicion here that this branch is representing all eukaryotic forms, right? Because they have a nucleus and other forms don't. And then we have this branch here, and I don't know, let's say maybe it's a mitochondrion. And you're like, well, that's kind of interesting, because I thought when we were reading in the textbook about the origins of eukaryotes, we didn't really have an explanation for the origin of eukaryotic cells. We just had an explanation for the origin of mitochondria. And see, so what I did here is I showed you that at some point you would need to have this happen first. So you actually need to have eukaryotic cells without mitochondria. This is another story for another time. And so you're looking at this here, and sometimes, not with this one, but sometimes you have a tendency to think, oh, cool, like these have a mitochondria, they don't need that feature anymore. Don't think that, okay? And so unless it's otherwise noted, as you branch here, you can assume that all of the features that came earlier are present in this form as well. Okay? Make sense? So we call those shared ancestral features. Those are called plesiomorphies. And that term is not in the text, and it's unfortunate. So I put it in there, and I brought it to you to increase your understanding and your knowledge and your ability to have an educated discussion. So shared ancestral features are called plesiomorphies. So if we were like, oh, man, look at these two groups here. These are sister taxa because they share a node. And then let's say you were like, I want to know what are the plesiomorphies for these sister taxa. You wouldn't go here because this isn't a shared ancestor. Actually, you could go here. I lied. You could go here too because this is the ancestor of these groups, and this is a feature that that ancestor has. So you could say, okay, well, the mitochondrion, that's a plesiomorphy. The nucleus. Nobody even said anything. Is that why y'all were laughing? I thought you were laughing just because, man. There's no C. Nucleus. What is that? Like, you're making stuff up just to mess with us. I wasn't. That was a mistake. You deserve better. I'm sorry. I tried to work all week, eating a lot, building my strength up so that I wouldn't make mistakes when y'all came back. I'm sorry. I didn't eat enough, apparently. All right. So these would all be plesiomorphies. Okay, they are shared ancestral features. And then you're like, well, what about those derived features that say only this branch has, and this its sister taxon does not, and this is what separates it, right? What are some features that this group has that this doesn't, so that we know that they're different? And those are shared derived features, and they're called synapomorphies. Shared derived features are called synapomorphies, and this is what we actually use to separate one branch from another. Do you notice any problems with my hypothetical phylogeny? Yeah, Joey.
It's not really what we always see.
What do we see?
We see because I feel like from what we've seen, we see features come and go a lot.
Okay, so you can see sometimes your synapomorphy is loss of a feature.
Yeah.
Okay, so loss of the mitochondrion. But another big issue with this is this looks to be representing eukaryotes. Well, this isn't the phylogeny of eukaryotes that we've seen. This is the phylogeny of eukaryotes that we've seen, right? So, except for the text doesn't include this, but you have to get this before you can develop the mitochondrion. And then we have a group here that its synapomorphy would be loss of the mitochondrion. You're like, but they just got it. That's so wasteful. They just got it from their ancestry and they don't even care. They just get rid of it. But then you're like, but these are parasites. They don't need it. They got something basically eating for them. Man, y'all, you were going to greet me with enthusiasm and excitement. We'll get there. So, yeah. So you have to remember that, you know, in this phylogeny, the other confusing aspect is you're like, okay, well, the synapomorphy for this whole branch here, which then branches further, is the presence of the mitochondrion. But oftentimes this branch keeps going. So you still keep getting a form that lacks those mitochondria ancestrally. Although we don't actually have any eukaryotes alive from this branch. But oftentimes you would. Okay, so that's another sometimes confusing thing about phylogeny is you look at it and you're like, oh, cool, new feature. The other organisms without that feature just die. But it doesn't actually work that way, right? I was going to make an analogy, but it wasn't very good, so I'll just pass. All right, lecture break time. And so what I want you to do is think back to phylogenies that we've discussed so far, okay? So think back to phylogenies that we've seen, we've talked about, we've pondered, we've, just put a lot of effort into understanding them, that had sister taxa that aren't very similar, okay? Think back to some of those specific phylogenies that we've seen so far and come up with some examples of sister taxa that are not very similar. Take 2 minutes in your same groups, give me a list of some of these sister taxa starting now.
Noah, do you want to lead? Cool.
Well, I mentioned mollusks. Anything in mollusca?
Mollusca?
Yeah.
All the sister stuff?
There are 3 of them, right?
Yeah.
What are the names? Cephalopoda, gastropoda.
I mean, you could also go with angiosperms and gymnosperms as well. Right? Well, I don't know if you could. Yeah.
What would define a sister taxa that are similar or not? How would you define that anyways?
I don't think there's really a standard, just kind of which ones are kind of pretty different.
If you look for a polytope,
Yeah.
anything in polytope.
I guess we'd have to go to where you actually get the sister taxonomy, like an individual species. What are different?
1 minute. 1 minute.
Any other examples?
Oh, here's
Some ready to and mediation.
no arthropods. You got a bunch of different ones there.
Are they,
Arthropoda, you got station, stuff like that underneath them.
being different doesn't mean they're obviously going to be different.
Oh yeah.
They're not very similar though. What's an example of a sister taxa that aren't going to be similar? First,
Or what are? Well, like you have to actually look at it and see.
10 seconds.
Split off and form those two separate groups.
right?
That's why I put a polytope.
Alrighty.
Come up from one.
Man, if any of you actually watch the videos on YouTube, it'd be kind of fun to like have those moments where I just yell 10 seconds. But since none of you actually watch them,
I watched some of them.
shamed. No, I'm just kidding. They usually have like 3 or 4 views each, and I'm okay with that. Obviously not, because I'm bringing it up and spilling my heart to.
A couple weeks ago that you would not be offended if people didn't watch.
No, I said I would not be offended if you didn't subscribe to my channel.
And no, I'm pretty sure you said if you
I
didn't
want.
watch them.
I was gonna say I want a recording, but I have one. I'm not offended. I'm sad. All right. I'm not really sad. I don't. All right. What do we have? What are some sister taxa that are not very similar?
The best example I can think of at the moment would have been, actually I didn't think of it, someone else did, was within mollusca, the three different groups in mollusca, gastropoda, cephalopoda, and the bivalves.
Yeah.
They aren't very similar. I mean, they have general similarities.
Yeah, they sure aren't. Yeah,
But
so
they're pretty
bivalves and, so the way it goes is cephalopods and scaphopods are sister taxa. And then bivalves are sister taxa to scaphopods and cephalopods together. And then gastropods are sister taxa to bivalves, cephalopods, and scaphopods together. And all of those are great examples of sister taxa that are not very similar. Yeah, mollusks are they're just fun. Like, it's a fun phylum. You know, arthropods, there's some different forms and it's exciting, but they tend to be pretty similar. But mollusks it's different. All right, what do we got here?
Yeah, we were gonna say the same thing with the,
Okay.
but specifically between cephalopods and scaphopods.
Okay. Cephalopods and scaphopods. Yep, those are like the smallest of those sister taxa. And they are super duper different. All right, what do we got back here? Turtles? Turtles to anything else, right? We don't even know what turtles are sister taxon to. It's like, what do you even do with turtles? What's that?
Maybe they're their own evolutionary tree. Like,
Maybe they are.
Like 2 cells, 1 branch, all of life, and then 1.
You know what's interesting is it James Watson or Francis Crick? I think it's Francis Crick. Basically came up with a solution to the problem of like the domains of life not really telling a very clear story. Is that life started somewhere else. It didn't actually start on this planet and came here in separate times. Separate times. Yeah, extraterrestrial life.
I think that was also pocket.
Yeah, maybe. All right. Wait, I didn't skip you. No, okay. Sorry. What do we have over here?
Okay, so like, what about the birds and the reptiles?
Okay, so yeah, if you want to go birds and then non-avian theropods. So you'd have to go like birds, because otherwise, I mean, if you're going to go something as specific as birds, you need to get a little bit more specific than reptiles. So you'd have to go birds and like T-Rex, right? The theropods that aren't birds. Yeah. Okay, I like it. So I went back really far to give you a couple of examples on the board. Yeah.
Just a quick question. Just thinking about mammals. Could a whale compare to a human be anything, or is that kind of like?
Well, so the idea with whales is the current idea with whales is that they sit inside of one of our ungulate groups, and there's some debate about whether they are in Artiodactyla, which would be with deer and cattle and pigs and giraffes and camels, or they sit in the other ungulate group, the Perissodactyls, which would be like rhinoceroses. I don't know which is actually true. It's probably both. Tapirs and horses. And so there's some debate where whales would actually sit in that. But yeah, I mean, you can use whales in that. If you want to go whales to humans, you'd have to go all the way back.
But it could be like whales and giraffes or something like that.
Sure. Yeah.
So the whale thing made me think. So where would dolphins link?
They'd be in the same place.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in that same group, cetaceans. So dolphins and other toothed whales, you could use those as sister taxa. You could do toothed whales and baleen whales, but then it gets a little bit interesting when you have fossil forms that have both teeth and baleen. You're like, what are they doing? They're chewing their food and filter feeding? That's selfish. Or shellfish? They're not shellfish. All right, so I went really back to give you some sister taxa that are not very similar. What is this circling here? So this branch right here is Opisthoconta. And so up here we would have, what's that? Well, so you have biconta and you have uniconta. In one of these you would have fungi, and then in one of them you have your animals. But these are two good sister taxa that are not very similar. And then let's go over here, back even further. And what are these two taxa? So this, look at this synapomorphy, life. So what is this representing? All of them, right? So you've got bacteria, you've got archaea, and eukaryotes. And so those are what these two taxa are. Archaeans, or archaea, and eukarya. Two sister taxa that are not very similar. And we could explain that, well, if they actually did root back to a single ancestor, it would have been somewhere between 1.2 and 1.6 billion years ago. That's a long time. A lot of time for diversification. And so here's probably the single worst phylogeny ever made. And so I put this in because it was so disappointing, because they want to give you an example of a phylogeny, but they do something you should never ever do, and that's get super specific when you're trying to represent huge taxa. So this is basically, we're representing all tetrapod, or not even tetrapods, sorry, all vertebrates. Well, lamprey are here, so let's all jawed fishes, okay? And we're going to represent them with 4 forms. Fish, generally, what kind of fish are you talking about? A frog, a lizard, and a rabbit. I mean, that's just a horrible thing to do. And they're like, look at this. Here are sister taxa that are not very similar, a rabbit and a lizard, right? You're like, oh yeah, well they share hair? Interesting.
They share eggs.
Yeah, well, an egg with an, man, they are not, this is just a horrible phylogeny. Because where they write this should be written here, and then hair should be written here as a synapomorphy just for this branch. This is really bad. So I wanted to put it on there just to show you how bad this is. And it's even worse than I thought. And they do this and they say, look at this. So you're like, rabbits and lizards, these are sister taxa. But they don't look as much alike as lizards and frogs do. And so this is why phylogenies can be confusing. And you're like, no, the reason this is confusing is you build a horrible, horrible phylogeny. Yeah.
So is this just saying that we're all rabbits?
No, this would actually be saying that we're all fish, including rabbits. Yeah, rabbits are fish. Frogs are fish, lizards are fish, which that's phylogenetics in general, phylogenetic systematics. It's not this one. This is just horrible. It's a horrible phylogeny. You're welcome for sharing it with you. All right, our last framing question. How does phylogenetics differ from taxonomy? All right, so both phylogenetics and classical taxonomy really aim to arrange groups in what we call in order of increasing exclusivity. And so exclusive meaning you're narrowing it down more and more and more and more and more, right? So yeah, I mean you could think of a bunch of examples from this. I'm not going to come up with one because I'll get myself in trouble. So both phylogenetics, systematics, classical taxonomy, both trying to arrange groups in order of increasing exclusivity. Okay, so in phylogenetics, as you branch smaller and smaller and smaller, you're getting into more and more exclusive groups, into groups that are excluding more and more different forms. Same thing with taxonomy, right? You start with something like a kingdom, and it includes all animals. And then you go to phylum and say it only includes mollusks. And then you go to class and it only includes gastropods. And then you go into order, which I'd used this example before and couldn't think of an order of a gastropod, and I still can't. And then you could go into family and you could do like Harpidae, which would be the harp snails. Beautiful shells that look like harps. And then you can go into there to a genus and you could do Harpa, the namesake genus. And then from there you can go into species, Harpa amaretta. Just a beautiful, look it up, beautiful, beautiful shell, beautiful snail. And so, yeah, what you're doing in there is getting into more and more exclusive groups. Now, where they're different. So phylogenetics will only use groups that are monophyletic. And what monophyletic means is it includes the ancestor and all of the descendants of that ancestor. So what we're looking at here then, the only way we would ever group these two together is if we could do it in such a way that has this ancestor, this node, and all of the descendants from that ancestor. Which you could. According to this, we could actually come up with a group for that, and there's different names assigned to that group. So taxonomy does the same thing. This was developed by Linnaeus, called Linnaean classification. And this will allow for paraphyletic groups. And these are groups where some of the ancestors are actually in a different group. And so an example to this are reptiles. Okay? So reptiles under the Linnaean scheme is still a valid taxon, even though it's believed that some of the ancestors would not be classified as reptiles, right? Birds wouldn't be classified as reptiles. Depending on what you mean by reptiles, mammals wouldn't be considered reptiles. But in a Linnaean scheme, that's still okay. In a phylogenetic scheme, that is not okay because it doesn't actually represent the evolutionary trajectory. So which would mean when you say reptiles, you would need to include birds. Okay? Otherwise, that taxon is not valid. Neither scheme will allow for what are called polyphyletic groups. Poly meaning many, phyletics meaning ancestry, and so this is where you have multiple different ancestries to make up a group. So under either scheme, if you find out that the shared feature is analogous and it is not, or it's convergence and it's not homologous, then you have to get rid of that group entirely under either scheme. Okay? Linnaean or phylogenetic systematics. If you find out that whatever that shared feature is not homologous, it didn't come from a shared ancestor, then that taxon has no meaning, and you have to get rid of it under either scheme. And you know why? Because people don't like groups that link things with multiple ancestries, because that sounds a lot like a creationist idea of origins, right? Where you have multiple ancestries all linking together. So you abandon those taxons regardless of which naming scheme you're staying true to. A couple of figures from the text. These are not nearly as bad as the phylogeny presented. This is just showing you getting into more and more exclusive groups until you get into the domestic dog, which is subspecies level, Canis lupus familiaris, versus Canis lupus, which includes several different subspecies of wolves, and then our domestic dog. And this one I thought was fun. So this does basically the same thing, but then backs it up and say, okay, well, what kind of other organisms would you expect to find in here? Look what they did when they got to carnivores. So they go back to the order of carnivora, which includes a lot of different forms. Weasels, seals, walruses, all kinds of different forms. And they put a cat in there just to spite all these dogs, right? So now you back it up a little bit, and you include some cats, and then from there you include some rabbits. And I don't know why that, dogs like to eat rabbits too, and I guess cats maybe would eat rabbits. Big cats, not a house cat. But that was kind of fun. All right? We're out of time. Enjoy the rest of your Monday.